Sir, I'm gonna have to ask you to leave. Let me help you out, folks. Are you ready for a big adventure, Jordan?
A wealthy black father carrying his exhausted 8-year-old son was thrown out of his own 5-star restaurant while dozens of wealthy diners watched in silence. Security officers surrounded him. The restaurant manager publicly accused him of disturbing guests, and people pulled out their phones to record what looked like another ordinary customer being removed from a luxury establishment. No one in that dining room realized the tired man wearing a faded gray hoodie had built the restaurant from nothing nearly 15 years earlier. Even more heartbreaking was the little boy clutching his father's hand, unable to understand why strangers kept treating them like they didn't belong. Before the night was over, careers would end, lives would change forever, and everyone inside that restaurant would learn a lesson they would never forget. If you've ever been judged before someone even knew your name, stay with this story because what happened next shocked everyone. Just 2 hours earlier, David Brooks hadn't planned to stop at the Crown Room at all. He and his 8-year-old son Jordan had spent the entire day driving back to Atlanta after attending a youth basketball tournament in Birmingham. The trip had been longer than expected because heavy rain slowed traffic for miles, and by the time they reached the city, both father and son were exhausted. Jordan had fallen asleep several times during the drive, waking only long enough to ask whether they were almost home before drifting back to sleep against the passenger side window. David could have driven another 30 minutes to their house, but after nearly 8 hours on the road, he decided they deserved a proper meal before ending the day. The Crown Room happened to be only a few blocks away. Most people believe David Brooks was rarely seen at his own restaurants because he preferred living the glamorous life of a successful businessman. The truth was completely different. David intentionally visited his restaurants without telling anyone beforehand because appearances changed the moment employees realized the owner was coming. Expensive suits created performances. Casual clothes revealed character. His late father had spent 25 years washing dishes in restaurants across Georgia and often reminded David that the true measure of hospitality wasn't how staff treated wealthy guests. It was how they treated the people they believed would never change their lives. David never forgot those words. That quiet lesson was exactly why he parked his truck across the street, slipped on his old gray hoodie, took Jordan's small hand, and walked toward the elegant restaurant he had spent half his life building. He had no idea that within the next 30 minutes, his own employees would throw him out of it. The Crown Room had become one of the most respected fine dining restaurants in Atlanta, attracting celebrities, business executives, politicians, and professional athletes from across the country. Reservations were often booked weeks in advance. Food critics praised its flawless service, and magazines regularly ranked it among the finest restaurants in the South. Guests admired the crystal chandeliers, the grand piano that filled the dining room with soft jazz every evening, and the impeccable hospitality that seemed to greet everyone who walked through its doors. Very few people knew that the elegant restaurant had started as a tiny neighborhood steakhouse with only 12 tables and a kitchen, so small the owner washed dishes between serving customers. David Brooks had built every piece of that success one sacrifice at a time, and even after becoming one of the country's most respected restaurateurs, he refused to forget where he came from. Jordan had grown up hearing those stories. He loved listening to his father talk about the early days when they couldn't afford expensive decorations, and every employee worked together to keep the business alive. Although David owned restaurants across several states, he never raised his son to believe wealth made anyone more important than another person. Jordan was taught to thank every server, smile at every cleaner, and treat every worker with the same respect he showed company executives. David believed character was inherited through example, not lectures. As they crossed the quiet street toward the glowing entrance, Jordan looked up at the beautiful building and asked if this was one of the restaurants his grandfather had inspired. David smiled warmly and told him it was. Jordan grinned, excited to finally eat at the famous restaurant he had heard so much about. He imagined enormous steaks, fresh bread, and the chocolate cake his father always described whenever he talked about the Crown Room. Neither of them realized they would never make it to a table. The hostess welcomed several elegantly dressed couples ahead of them before finally looking toward David and Jordan. Her pleasant smile faded almost instantly as her eyes traveled from David's faded hoodie to his worn sneakers before briefly resting on Jordan's simple backpack. Without saying anything rude, she hesitated just long enough for David to recognize the familiar look. It was the silent calculation people often made before deciding whether someone belonged. She politely asked whether they had a reservation. David admitted they didn't and explained they had been driving all day and simply hoped a table might still be available. Before the hostess could respond, the restaurant manager, Charles Whitmore, happened to walk past the front entrance. Charles was known throughout the restaurant for demanding perfection from every employee. Impeccably dressed in a tailored black suit with polished shoes that reflected the chandelier lights, he carried himself with the confidence of someone who believed appearances determined first impressions. He noticed David almost immediately. His eyes narrowed for only a second. Then he quietly walked toward the host's stand. Within moments, the evening David had spent 15 years building was about to become the most painful inspection of his entire career. Charles Whitmore had spent almost 8 years climbing through the ranks of Brooks' dining group. He was efficient, organized, and obsessed with maintaining what he called the restaurant's exclusive image. Unfortunately, somewhere along the way he had started believing that luxury wasn't defined by exceptional service, but by the appearance of the people receiving it. Without realizing it, he had slowly replaced hospitality with judgment, and tonight he was about to prove it. As he approached the entrance, he greeted the hostess with a polite smile before shifting his attention to David and Jordan. He didn't ask where they had come from or whether they had enjoyed their drive. Instead, his eyes quietly examined David's hoodie, the small backpack hanging from Jordan's shoulder, and the old pickup truck parked across the street. Before either father or son had spoken another word, Charles had already made up his mind. He politely informed David that the restaurant was fully committed for the evening and suggested there were several family restaurants only a few minutes away that would probably have available seating. His tone remained professional, but the message behind the words was impossible to miss. He wasn't simply saying there were no tables. He was saying this wasn't the place for people who looked like them. David listened calmly. During years of visiting his restaurants without warning, he had learned not to react too quickly. Sometimes misunderstandings happened, and good managers corrected them immediately. He decided to give Charles that opportunity. With complete respect, David asked whether every table was truly occupied because he had noticed several empty seats through the large glass windows while walking toward the entrance. Charles barely glanced over his shoulder before confidently explaining that those tables were reserved for expected guests. David simply nodded. He wasn't interested in arguing. He only wanted to observe. Less than 2 minutes later, the restaurant doors opened again. A well-dressed couple stepped inside laughing as they shook the rain from their umbrellas. The hostess warmly welcomed them and politely asked whether they had a reservation. The couple admitted they didn't, explaining they had decided to stop by on the way home after seeing the restaurant from across the street. Charles's entire attitude changed. His smile grew warmer. His posture relaxed. Without the slightest hesitation, he instructed the hostess to prepare one of the supposedly reserved tables. Within moments, menus were placed in their hands. A server escorted them into the elegant dining room, and complimentary champagne was already being prepared before they even reached their seats. David watched the entire exchange without saying a word. Jordan looked up at his father with innocent confusion. He had heard the manager explain there weren't any available tables, yet another family had been seated almost immediately. Children often noticed unfairness long before adults admitted it existed. David looked down at his son and gently squeezed his shoulder, silently reminding him to remain patient. Inside, however, disappointment was beginning to replace curiosity. This was no longer a misunderstanding. This was a choice. Near the entrance, one young waitress had quietly witnessed everything while carrying a tray of freshly baked bread toward another table. She looked from David to the newly seated couple before glancing uneasily toward Charles. Even she could see something wasn't right. She hesitated for only a second, then quietly walked toward David and Jordan. That small act of kindness was about to change the entire course of the evening. The young waitress's name was Maya, and although she had only worked at the Crown Room for a little over a year, she understood something many employees eventually forgot. Hospitality wasn't about deciding who deserved kindness. It was about making every guest feel welcome the moment they walked through the door. Looking at David and Jordan standing quietly near the entrance, She couldn't ignore the feeling that something was deeply wrong. She approached them with a warm smile and sincerely apologized for the delay. Without questioning how they were dressed or where they had come from, she politely explained that she would be happy to check once more for an available table. It was a small gesture, but after the way they had been treated, it reminded Jordan that not everyone in the restaurant had judged them before getting to know them. David thanked her with genuine appreciation. He wasn't looking for special treatment. In fact, Maya's simple kindness confirmed something he had believed for years. A company's culture was rarely destroyed by everyone at once. It changed little by little until good employees either adapted to the wrong standard or found the courage to stand against it. Before Maya could reach the reservation desk, Charles called her name. His voice wasn't loud, but it was firm enough to stop her in her tracks. He calmly reminded her that management had already handled the situation and instructed her to return to her section before her own guests began waiting for service. Maya hesitated for only a moment. She wanted to argue that the restaurant still had empty tables, but she also understood the difficult position she was in. Challenging the manager in front of customers could cost her the job she depended on to help support her younger brother through college. Reluctantly, she apologized to David once again before returning to the dining room. David watched the exchange carefully. He didn't blame Maya. If anything, he admired her. She had shown more compassion in 30 seconds than management had shown all evening. Jordan quietly looked up at his father and asked whether they should simply leave and find another restaurant. David smiled gently and told him they would leave if they had to, but sometimes the right thing to do was to stay long enough to understand why something was happening. Jordan trusted his father completely, even if he didn't fully understand what he meant. Just then another family entered the restaurant. A middle-aged businessman wearing an expensive tailored suit walked through the doors with his wife and teenage daughter. Like David, they had no reservation. Unlike David, they were welcomed almost immediately. Charles greeted them personally with a broad smile, shook the man's hand, apologized for the short wait, and within less than a minute another reserved table suddenly became available. David didn't react. He simply looked around the restaurant. Several empty tables remained untouched. The excuse about reservations had completely fallen apart. This was no longer about availability. It was about appearance. A few nearby guests had begun noticing the uncomfortable scene unfolding near the entrance. Quiet conversation slowed as people glanced toward David and Jordan before looking back at Charles. Some seemed confused. Others looked uncomfortable. They hadn't heard every word, but they had seen enough to realize something didn't feel right. Charles noticed the attention as well. His polished smile began fading. The longer David remained standing there, the more curious other guests became. And curiosity was the last thing Charles wanted spreading through his perfectly managed restaurant. The two security officers walked across the dining room with calm, measured steps, drawing the attention of nearly every guest in the restaurant. Conversations gradually faded, forks paused halfway to plates, and even the pianist glanced toward the entrance before quietly continuing to play. Nobody understood what had happened, but everyone could see that a father and his young son were somehow at the center of it. David remained completely still. He had seen moments like this before, not in his own restaurants, but during the years before success found him. His father had often been followed through department stores because employees assumed he intended to steal. As a teenager, David had watched restaurant managers ignore his father while greeting customers standing right beside him. Those memories had shaped the kind of business leader he wanted to become. He had promised himself that if he ever owned a restaurant, every guest would be treated with dignity before anyone knew their name, occupation, or bank account. Tonight, that promise was being broken inside the very restaurant he had built. The older of the two security officers approached first. His name was Samuel Carter, a man who had worked security for nearly 20 years. Unlike Charles, Samuel didn't immediately focus on David's clothes. Instead, he noticed a tired father protecting his son from an uncomfortable situation. Experience had taught him that appearances rarely told the whole story. He politely explained that management had requested David and Jordan leave the restaurant. David nodded respectfully. He didn't argue. He didn't resist. Instead, he calmly asked Samuel whether he personally believed they had done anything wrong. The question caught the security officer by surprise. He looked at David, then at Jordan, then briefly toward Charles. Deep down, Samuel already knew the answer. He simply couldn't say it. David understood immediately. This wasn't Samuel's decision. He was simply carrying out someone else's order. David thanked him for treating them respectfully and gently squeezed Jordan's shoulder, reminding him to stay close. Jordan quietly reached for his father's hand without saying a word. He could feel dozens of strangers watching them, and although he didn't understand why, he trusted his father completely. Charles watched from several feet away with his arms folded across his chest. From his perspective, the situation was finally ending. Once David and his son walked outside, the restaurant would return to normal, guests would forget the brief interruption, and another successful evening would continue as planned. He couldn't have been more wrong. As Samuel slowly escorted David toward the entrance, Jordan suddenly looked up at his father with innocent confusion. He quietly asked why everyone kept looking at them as though they had done something bad. The question wasn't loud, but in the silence that had settled across the dining room, almost everyone heard it. Several guests lowered their eyes. An elderly woman sitting near the window slowly placed her napkin on the table. Even Maya, the young waitress, stopped walking for a moment as guilt spread across her face. No child should ever have to ask a question like that. David knelt beside Jordan and smiled reassuringly. He gently explained that sometimes people judged others before they knew their story, but that said far more about the person judging than the person being judged. He reminded his son that kindness should never depend on someone's appearance because everyone deserved respect the moment they walked through a door. Jordan nodded quietly. Those simple words stayed with several guests who overheard them. For the first time that evening, people weren't looking at David with curiosity. They were looking at him with admiration. Meanwhile, David slowly reached into the pocket of his gray hoodie. Charles immediately stiffened. Several guests leaned forward. Even Samuel instinctively watched the movement. Instead of pulling out a wallet or identification, David simply took out his phone. He scrolled to one contact. Press call. And calmly said just one sentence. I'm at the Crown Room. I think it's time you came down here. He ended the call less than 20 seconds later, slipped the phone back into his pocket, and quietly thanked Samuel once again. Charles smiled to himself. He assumed David had called someone to come pick them up. He had absolutely no idea that the person who answered the phone was already on the way, and in less than 5 minutes, the entire restaurant would discover the biggest mistake of Charles Whitmore's career. David slipped his phone back into the pocket of his hoodie and returned his full attention to Jordan, who was beginning to look exhausted after standing near the entrance for so long. The little boy tried to smile, but the excitement he had felt only half an hour earlier had completely disappeared. He had imagined sharing one of his father's favorite meals while listening to stories about how the restaurant had been built. Instead, he found himself wondering why they weren't welcome inside. David gently placed a hand on his son's shoulder and reminded him that the way people treated you often revealed more about them than it did about you. Jordan quietly nodded, holding on to every word. David knew this night would stay with him for years, which was exactly why he wanted his son to remember the lesson instead of the humiliation. Across the dining room, Charles finally felt confident the situation was ending. He thanked the security officers for handling everything and returned to greeting newly arriving guests, as though nothing unusual had happened. Within moments he was smiling warmly at another couple, personally escorting them toward one of the very tables he had insisted was unavailable only minutes earlier. David noticed. So did several guests. An elderly gentleman near the fireplace slowly shook his head while whispering something to his wife. At another table, a young couple quietly stopped eating altogether. Nobody was making a scene, but the atmosphere had changed. The elegance of the restaurant had been replaced by an uncomfortable silence that no amount of soft piano music could cover. Then something unexpected happened. The restaurant side entrance quietly opened. A middle-aged man wearing a navy business suit stepped inside, followed by 2 other executives. They weren't guests. They walked with purpose, speaking quietly among themselves before stopping near the reception area. Charles noticed them immediately and assumed they were important investors or corporate visitors. Straightening his jacket, he hurried toward them with the biggest smile he had worn all evening. Before Charles could introduce himself, the lead executive politely raised a hand, signaling that there was no need for greetings. His eyes were already fixed on David. Charles frowned slightly. He glanced toward David, then back at the executives. Something didn't make sense. The lead executive slowly crossed the dining room without saying a word. Every employee instinctively watched him. Maya stopped serving a table. Samuel remained near the entrance. Even the guests followed the unusual silence as the well-dressed executive walked directly toward the man in the gray hoodie. David looked up and offered a small smile. The executive stopped in front of him. Without hesitation, he extended his hand. His voice carried clearly through the now silent restaurant. "Good evening, Mr. Brooks. I came as quickly as I could." Every conversation stopped. Charles felt his stomach tighten. The words echoed inside his mind. "Mr. Brooks." He slowly turned toward David, then back toward the executive. For the first time that evening, a terrible realization began to settle over him. The tired father he had refused to serve wasn't waiting for someone to rescue him. Everyone else had just arrived to answer to him. For several long seconds, nobody moved. Charles stood frozen near the reception desk, trying to convince himself he had misunderstood what he had just heard. The executive had addressed the man in the gray hoodie with genuine respect, not the forced politeness reserved for important customers, but the kind of respect people showed someone who held real authority. Around the dining room, employees exchanged nervous glances while guests quietly watched the unfolding scene, sensing they were witnessing something none of them would soon forget. The executive, whose name was Michael Reynolds, Chief Operating Officer of Brooks Dining Group, turned toward Charles with a calm expression that revealed very little. He didn't raise his voice or create unnecessary drama. Instead, he asked one simple question. Would someone explain why the founder of this company and his son are standing at the entrance instead of enjoying dinner? The question hung over the restaurant like a heavy weight. No one answered. Charles opened his mouth, but the words refused to come. Every explanation he had prepared during the past 30 minutes suddenly sounded meaningless. He couldn't say there were no tables because several remained empty. He couldn't claim David had caused a disturbance because every guest had watched him remain respectful from the moment he arrived. The truth was painfully simple. He had judged a man before learning who he was. Michael slowly looked around the dining room before turning back toward David. He apologized for what had happened and assured him that the situation would be addressed immediately. David thanked him, but made it clear that he hadn't called anyone simply to expose a manager. If that had been his goal, he would have revealed his identity the moment he walked through the front door. Instead, he wanted to see whether the values this company was built on still existed when nobody believed the owner was watching. Those words struck every employee differently. Maya lowered her eyes, remembering how helpless she had felt. Samuel silently replayed every moment from the evening, relieved he had chosen respect even while following orders. Several servers looked toward Charles, realizing this had never been about reservations or restaurant policy. It had always been about assumptions. Jordan looked around the room with quiet curiosity. Only minutes earlier, people had stared at his father with suspicion. Now the very same employees stood in complete silence, waiting for him to speak. The little boy squeezed his father's hand, still trying to understand how everything had changed so quickly. David smiled gently at his son before looking across the restaurant. He explained that nothing had actually changed. The only difference was that people now knew his name. His character had been exactly the same when he walked through the door. His clothes were the same. His son was the same. His request for a simple dinner was the same. The only thing that had changed was everyone's perception. The words settled over the restaurant with remarkable force. Several guests quietly nodded. One elderly woman gently wiped away a tear. She wasn't emotional because the owner had been recognized. She was emotional because she realized how many ordinary people had probably experienced the same kind of treatment without anyone ever discovering the truth afterward. David slowly looked toward Charles. There was no anger in his expression, only disappointment. And somehow, that was far more difficult to face. Charles felt every eye in the restaurant settle on him. Just minutes earlier he had stood confidently giving instructions, convinced he was protecting the image of an exclusive establishment. Now that same image was exposing the flaw in his leadership. Luxury had never been about crystal chandeliers or expensive wine. It had always been about making every guest feel valued, and he had failed the simplest test of all. David slowly stepped forward with Jordan still standing beside him. He wasn't interested in embarrassing anyone. Public humiliation had already done enough damage that evening. He wanted every employee to understand exactly why this moment mattered, not just for the company, but for every person who would walk through those doors in the future. He calmly explained that he had spent years visiting his restaurants without announcing himself because inspections prepared in advance never revealed the truth. Employees cleaned harder, smiled wider, and followed every policy when they knew the owner was coming. Real leadership was measured on ordinary nights when no one believed anyone important was watching. He looked around the dining room before continuing. The first person who enters a restaurant should receive the same respect as the last. The guest wearing a tailored suit should be treated no better than the guest wearing work boots. A parent walking in with a child deserves the same welcome as a celebrity or a billionaire. If our standards only apply to people who look successful, then we don't have standards at all. The restaurant remained completely silent. Every employee listened. Every guest watched. David then turned toward Maya. He thanked her for being the only person who had stepped forward without knowing who he was. She hadn't offered kindness because she expected a reward. She had simply seen two tired people who deserved compassion. David explained that businesses rarely succeeded because of beautiful buildings or expensive menus. They succeeded because of employees who chose to do the right thing even when nobody was keeping score. Maya lowered her head, overwhelmed by the unexpected praise. She hadn't been trying to impress anyone. She had simply followed her heart. David then looked towards Samuel, the senior security officer. He thanked him as well. Samuel had obeyed instructions, but he had never forgotten that the people standing in front of him were human beings first. He had remained respectful from beginning to end, proving that professionalism and kindness could exist together. David told him that true security wasn't about removing people. It was about protecting the dignity of everyone inside the building. Samuel quietly nodded, deeply humbled. Finally, David faced Charles once more. He told him that his greatest mistake wasn't refusing a table. It wasn't even judging a customer by appearance. His greatest mistake was allowing assumptions to become company policy without realizing it. Somewhere along the way, he had confused exclusivity with excellence, forgetting that hospitality was never meant to exclude people. It was meant to welcome them. Charles lowered his head. For the first time all evening, he truly understood what he had done, and he knew the consequences were only moments away. The restaurant remained silent as David looked at Charles one final time. There was no satisfaction in his expression because this had never been about catching someone making a mistake. It had been about discovering whether the culture he had spent 15 years building still reflected the values that made the company successful in the first place. Unfortunately, tonight had given him his answer. Charles finally lifted his head and admitted he had been wrong. He confessed that over the years he had become so focused on protecting the restaurant's reputation that he had forgotten the very people the reputation was supposed to serve. He apologized to David, but more importantly, he apologized for making Jordan experience something no child should ever have to witness. David accepted the apology with a slight nod. He believed people could make mistakes. He also believed leadership came with responsibility. A manager's decisions affected every employee beneath them and every guest who walked through the door. When those decisions consistently reflected the wrong values, leadership had to change. David calmly informed Charles that his employment with Brooks Dining Group would end that evening. No one gasped. No one applauded. The decision wasn't made out of revenge. It was made to protect the future of the company. Charles slowly removed the manager's badge from his jacket and placed it on the reception desk. Without another word, he thanked David for the opportunity he had been given over the years before quietly walking toward the staff corridor. Several employees watched him leave with mixed emotions. They respected the years he had devoted to the restaurant, but they also understood that the standards of the company had to come before any individual. Once Charles disappeared from sight, David turned toward Maya. He smiled warmly and thanked her again for reminding him that the heart of the company was still alive. Compassion couldn't be taught by a handbook alone. It came from character, and she had demonstrated that character when it mattered most. Right there in front of the staff, David announced that Maya would begin training as the restaurant's new guest experience supervisor. Her responsibility would be simple. Every guest who entered the crown room would leave feeling respected, whether they ordered the most expensive meal on the menu or only a cup of coffee. Tears filled Maya's eyes. She hadn't expected recognition. She certainly hadn't expected a promotion. All she had done was treat two strangers the way she believed every person deserved to be treated. David then turned toward Samuel. He thanked the veteran security officer for carrying out his responsibilities with patience and dignity despite being placed in a difficult situation. He explained that leadership wasn't only found in offices or boardrooms. Sometimes it was found in ordinary people who refused to stop treating others with respect, even when circumstances became uncomfortable. Samuel smiled modestly. After nearly 20 years in security, those words meant more to him than any award. David looked around the dining room one last time. Guests were no longer staring because he was the owner. They were watching because they had just witnessed something rare. A leader who cared more about principles than pride. Then Jordan gently tugged on his father's sleeve. With a small smile, he quietly reminded him that they had originally come for one reason. They were both still hungry. The simple comment made several guests laugh softly, breaking the tension that had filled the restaurant all evening. David smiled down at his son. Then, for the first time that night, he asked for a table. And this time, it wasn't because he owned the restaurant. It was because every guest deserved one. A few minutes later, David and Jordan were finally seated at one of the same tables that had supposedly been reserved all evening. The atmosphere inside the Crown Room felt completely different now. Employees greeted every guest with renewed warmth. Conversations slowly returned, and the soft piano music once again filled the dining room. For the first time that night, Jordan smiled the way he had when they first arrived. As they waited for their meal, Jordan looked across the elegant restaurant before turning to his father with quiet curiosity. He wanted to know why David hadn't simply told everyone he owned the restaurant the moment they refused to serve them. It would have saved them from everything that happened. David smiled. He explained that revealing his identity would only have earned him respect because of his position. What mattered was discovering how the restaurant treated someone they believed was just an ordinary father trying to feed his son. If the company only showed kindness to people with influence, then everything he had spent years building would have meant nothing. Jordan thought about his father's words for a long moment before slowly nodding. That night, he learned something no classroom could ever teach him. Real character isn't revealed when important people are watching. It's revealed when you believe no one is. 3 months later, David returned to the Crown Room wearing the same gray hoodie and old jeans. This time, he came alone without notifying anyone. The moment he stepped through the front door, a smiling hostess warmly welcomed him, thanked him for visiting, and politely asked how many would be dining. Across the dining room, Maya confidently led the front of house team, making every arriving guest feel genuinely appreciated regardless of how they were dressed. Near the entrance, Samuel greeted families, business travelers, elderly couples, and young students with the exact same respect he offered everyone else. David quietly watched for nearly 20 minutes. A construction worker was seated with the same courtesy as a corporate executive. A young couple celebrating their anniversary received the same attention as a famous athlete dining across the room. No one was judged. No one was overlooked. No one was made to feel as though they didn't belong. For the first time in a long time, David smiled with complete peace. The restaurant hadn't changed because new furniture had been purchased or because expensive renovations had been completed. It had changed because the people inside finally understood what hospitality truly meant. As David stood to leave, Maya recognized him and smiled. He simply nodded back before walking toward the exit. He didn't need applause, recognition, or special treatment. The greatest reward was knowing that the lesson from that unforgettable night would be experienced by thousands of future guests who would never know the story behind it. Because true hospitality isn't measured by luxury. It's measured by kindness. And kindness should never depend on someone's clothes, job title, or the size of their bank account. If this story touched your heart, let us know in the comments what lesson stayed with you the most. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications for more powerful stories that remind us why compassion, integrity, and respect will always matter more than appearances. Until next time, remember this: every person deserves dignity before they ever have to prove their worth.